What if I told you America was never truly finished? Not in 1776, not after the Civil War, not even today. What if the story you think you know is only half the truth? Because the real history lives in struggle, silence, resistance, and courage that textbooks often skip. For over 423 years, this nation has been an argument between freedom and fear, promise and power. Every generation was tested. Some passed, some failed. The question is not what America was. The question is what it is becoming. And whether we are brave enough to face that truth will explain everything in this video, step by step. Don't skip it. 423 years of American history, a human story of becoming. 423 years, that is how long the idea of America has been struggling to be born, falling, rising, failing, and trying again. America did not begin as a nation. It began as a gamble. Fragile wooden ships crossing a violent ocean, carrying fear, faith, ambition, and contradiction. In 1607 at Jamestown, survival came before freedom. Hunger stalked the settlement. Death outnumbered hope. And even in those earliest days, two truths were planted side by side, the desire for liberty and the willingness to deny it to others. History rarely begins cleanly. America is no exception. Before settlers called this land new, it was already ancient, home to millions of native people with languages, laws, and lives rooted in the soil. Their displacement is not a footnote. It is a foundation stone of the American story, heavy and unresolved. And then came slavery. Men, women, and children were chained and carried across the Atlantic, forced to build wealth they would never own, liberty they would never taste. The paradox was complete. A land speaking of freedom sustained by bondage. This contradiction would haunt every generation to come. Yet history does not move in straight lines. It moves through tension. By 1776, words ignited a revolution. All men are created equal. It was a radical idea, unfinished, imperfect, but dangerous in its promise. The founders did not live up to it, but they wrote it down. And by writing it, they gave future Americans something powerful, a standard by which to judge the nation itself. America was born not as a finished product, but as an argument. The 19th century tested that argument with fire. Expansion brought opportunity and devastation. The frontier grew, but so did injustice. Slavery expanded. Families were torn apart. Native nations were forced westward on death marches remembered as policy. Then came the Civil War, when the nation nearly destroyed itself over the meaning of human freedom. Brother fought brother. Fields ran red. And when the war ended, slavery died, but equality did not yet live. Reconstruction offered a glimpse of what America could be. It was brief. It was betrayed. Jim Crow followed, and the promise of freedom was locked behind law and terror. Still, people resisted. The 20th century brought both triumph and tragedy. America became an industrial power, then a global one. It fought fascism abroad while tolerating racism at home. It landed on the moon while denying basic rights to millions on Earth. But courage rose again. Ordinary citizens, students, pastors, workers, mothers stood up and said no more. The civil rights movement forced the nation to confront its conscience. Progress did not come as a gift. It came through sacrifice, through jail cells and bloodied streets, through faith in a future not yet visible. America learned again that democracy is not inherited, it is practiced. The late 20th and early 21st centuries brought new challenges, terror and fear, division and doubt, prosperity and inequality side by side. Technology accelerated life, but wisdom struggled to keep pace. The old questions returned in new forms. Who belongs? Who is heard? What does freedom really mean? Through every war, every movement, every moment of reckoning, one truth remains. America is not a place. It is a process. It is the ongoing effort to turn ideals into reality. It is the belief that tomorrow can be better than yesterday, not because history guarantees it, but because people demand it. 423 years later, the story is unfinished. And that is not a weakness. It is the point. The American experiment survives not because it is flawless, but because generation after generation has refused to stop believing in the possibility of a more perfect union. History does not ask us to worship the past. It asks us to learn from it. The question before us now is the same one faced in 1607, in 1776, in 1865, in 1965. Will we live up to the promise we inherited? The answer, like America itself, remains in our hands. America was born as an idea before it became a nation, long before borders were drawn, before flags were stitched, before constitutions were signed. There existed a belief, fragile, dangerous, unfinished, that people could govern themselves and that power did not have to flow only from kings, crowns, or inherited bloodlines. This idea did not arrive fully formed, nor was it born in purity. It emerged slowly, shaped by fear and hope, by faith and ambition, carried across an ocean by people fleeing constraint while often carrying their own contradictions with them. In the early 17th century, those who came to the Atlantic coast were not dreaming of democracy in the modern sense. They were searching for survival, profit, religious breathing room, or a second chance at life. Yet in the harsh reality of the New World, where authority from distant monarchs felt thin and unreliable, people were forced to make decisions together. They debated, argued, voted, failed, and tried again. Out of necessity, participation took root. The idea that ordinary people had a voice, however limited, began to grow not as philosophy, but as practice. These early settlements were chaotic and unequal, ruled by hierarchy and exclusion, but even within them, something new was stirring. Town meetings, local councils, written agreements, and shared responsibilities created habits of self-rule. The Mayflower Compact, signed not by nobles but by settlers themselves, was not a declaration of freedom for all, yet it carried a revolutionary implication. Legitimacy could come from consent rather than command. The idea mattered more than its immediate reach. The distance from Europe mattered in the absence of constant royal supervision. Colonists learned to improvise. They learned that authority could be questioned, that rules could be reshaped, that survival sometimes depended on cooperation rather than obedience. Over generations, this bred a mindset less deferential, more skeptical of absolute power. The land was vast, the crown was far away, and the daily decisions of life rested increasingly in local hands. Religious dissent also shaped this emerging idea. Those fleeing persecution carried with them a deep suspicion of enforced belief. While tolerance was often uneven and hypocritical, the memory of imposed faith lingered. The notion that conscience could not be commanded by the state quietly embedded itself into colonial life. Freedom of belief was not yet universal, but the seed had been planted. Br. At the same time, the idea of America was being shaped by contradiction. Slavery existed alongside talk of liberty. Indigenous nations were pushed aside in the name of settlement. Women were excluded from political life. The idea of self-government was applied selectively, guarded tightly by those in power. Yet even in this restricted form, the language of rights and consent created a tension that could not be easily silenced. Once spoken, ideas have a way of traveling beyond their original limits. The Enlightenment gave this growing mindset a vocabulary. Concepts of natural rights, social contracts, and equality before the law flowed across the Atlantic in books and pamphlets, debated in taverns and meeting houses. These ideas did not create American self-rule, they gave it intellectual shape. Colonists recognized themselves in the words, what they had been practicing, imperfectly. Philosophy now justified boldly. By the mid-18th century, many colonists no longer saw themselves as merely subjects. They had lived for generations making their own laws, managing their own affairs, defending their own communities. When the British Crown attempted to reassert control through taxes and decrees, it was not just money that was at stake. It was the idea that authority required representation, that power without consent was illegitimate. Resistance was not inevitable, but it was logical. The revolution began in the mind before it reached the battlefield. Pamphlet. Like common sense did not invent anger, they clarified it. They transformed scattered grievances into a coherent argument. They spoke to farmers and merchants in language that made them participants in history rather than spectators. The Declaration of Independence did not create equality, but it named it. It took an abstract belief and placed it on parchment, declaring it self-evident. This was not a description of reality. It was a claim about what reality should become. The power of the document lay not in its immediate truth, but in its enduring challenge. It defined America not by what it was, but by what it aspired to be. Our war followed, but the idea outlived the fighting. When independence was secured, the harder work began. How does an idea govern? How does belief become structure? The Articles of Confederation revealed fear of centralized power, a reflection of colonial memory. The Constitution that followed was an attempt to balance liberty and order, distrust and necessity. It was an argument written into law, designed to evolve, amended rather than abandoned. The nation that emerged was incomplete, uneven, morally compromised, yet anchored to an idea that could not be erased. America was not unified by blood, language, or religion. It was unified by a shared experiment, the belief that a people could argue openly, correct themselves, and remain free. This made the nation fragile, but it also made it resilient. Bar, because America began as an idea, it has always been contested. Every expansion of rights, every movement for justice, every demand for inclusion has drawn strength from that original claim. Those denied freedom have used the nation's own language to challenge it. The idea has proven larger than its founders, stronger than their limitations. To say America was born as an idea is to understand that its history is not a straight march of progress, but a continual negotiation between promise and practice. The nation exists not because it solved the problem of human equality, but because it dared to state the problem publicly. That declaration turned belief into responsibility and responsibility into struggle. Binding generations to a vision that existed before the country itself, freedom and contradiction were planted together from the very beginning, intertwined so deeply that it is impossible to tell the story of one without confronting the other. From the earliest days of settlement, the language of liberty lived beside systems of control, and the promise of opportunity grew in soil watered by injustice. This was not an accident of history, it was a defining condition. America did not stumble into contradiction later. It was born carrying it. The settlers who crossed the Atlantic often spoke of escape. They fled rigid hierarchies, religious persecution, economic stagnation, and the suffocating weight of inherited class. They imagined a place where effort could matter more than ancestry, where land could be owned, where futures could be shaped by will rather than decree. Yet even as they articulated these hopes, they replicated the very structures of domination they claimed to reject. Freedom was desired intensely, but narrowly defined. From the start, liberty was treated as a possession rather than a principle. It was something to be claimed for oneself, not necessarily extended to others. The same ships that carried those seeking self-determination also carried human beings in chains. The same settlements that argued against tyranny depended on forced labor to survive and grow. The contradiction was not hidden, it was normalized. Slavery was not peripheral to the early American economy. It was central. It financed expansion, enriched ports, and built institutions. Tobacco, rice, cotton, and later sugar tied freedom for some to bondage for others. This created a moral imbalance that could not be reconciled, only managed. Laws were written to protect property, and human beings were defined as such. The language of freedom bent around this reality, stretched but not broken, allowing contradiction to harden into structure. At the same time, Native peoples were treated as obstacles to progress rather than participants in history. Treaties were signed and broken, land was taken under legal language that disguised violence, and entire nations were displaced in the name of destiny. The idea of freedom expanded geographically while contracting ethically. Expansion was celebrated as opportunity, then as it erased lives, cultures, and histories. The revolutionary generation inherited this tangled reality and deepened it. They spoke with clarity about natural rights and tyranny, crafting arguments that still echo through time. Yet many of those voices owned enslaved people. They feared concentrated power, but exercised unchecked authority within their own households. They declared liberty universal while designing a system that excluded women, indigenous peoples, and the enslaved from its protection. This contradiction did not weaken the ideals, it made them dangerous. By declaring principles that exceeded their own actions, the founders created a moral tension that could not remain static. The words they chose were broader than their intentions. All men are created equal was not true in practice, but it was explosive in implication. Once written, it belonged not only to its authors, but to everyone it excluded. The early republic struggled to live inside this paradox. Laws and compromises attempted to balance opposing realities, delaying conflict rather than resolving it. The Constitution protected slavery even as it gestured toward liberty. Representation was counted in fractions of humanity. Freedom was institutionalized alongside exclusion, not as a temporary failure, but as a calculated arrangement. Over time, the contradiction deepened rather than faded. As the nation expanded, so did the question of who would benefit from its growth. New territories forced old. Debates into new spaces. Each generation inherited the unresolved tension between what America claimed to be and what it allowed itself to do. Political arguments were never just about policy. They were about the meaning of freedom itself. The contradiction shaped culture as much as law. Americans learned to celebrate independence while tolerating inequality. They told stories of self-made success while ignoring the systems that prevented others from starting. The mythology of liberty grew powerful, even as its application remained uneven. This duality allowed the nation to see itself as righteous while avoiding full accountability. Yet contradiction also became a source of pressure. Those denied freedom understood the language better than those who monopolized it. Enslaved people heard the promises and recognized the hypocrisy. Abolitionists used the nation's own ideals as weapons against it. Women demanded inclusion by pointing to the same principles that excluded them. The contradiction became a lever for change. Conflict was inevitable. A nation cannot indefinitely proclaim freedom while enforcing bondage. The Civil War was not merely a political crisis, it was the violent collision of two irreconcilable realities. The war did not end contradiction, but it stripped away illusion. Slavery was abolished, but equality was not delivered. Freedom expanded legally while retreating socially. New forms of control replaced old ones, and the contradiction adapted rather than disappeared. The post-war era revealed how deeply embedded the tension was. Reconstruction offered a moment when freedom seemed capable of transformation, when citizenship and rights were briefly extended in meaningful ways. That moment was short-lived. The retreat from equality was swift, enforced through law, violence, and silence. Freedom existed on paper, while terror governed daily life for millions. Throughout the 20th century, the pattern repeated. America presented itself as a defender of liberty on the world stage while denying basic rights at home. Soldiers fought for freedom abroad while segregation defined life at home. Economic prosperity grew while inequality widened. Each achievement carried its shadow, each victory its cost. The contradiction survived because it was useful. It allowed the nation to move forward without fully looking inward. It permitted progress without justice, unity without truth. But it also ensured unrest. Movements for civil rights, labor rights, and human dignity all emerged from the same fault line. They were not rejections of American ideals. They were demands that those ideals be taken seriously. Freedom and contradiction continue to exist side by side because the nation has never fully chosen between comfort and conscience. Progress has always required pressure. Rights have never been given freely. They have been extracted from the tension between what America says and what America does. The contradiction has shaped every genre. Chion's struggle, forcing the nation to confront itself again and again. To understand American history is not to search for a moment when contradiction vanished, but to recognize how it has driven change and resistance. The story is not one of steady moral ascent, but of recurring confrontation between ideals and reality. Freedom was planted alongside contradiction, and both have grown together, shaping the nation's character, its conflicts, and its unfinished pursuit of justice. A nation has been shaped by struggle, resistance, and moral courage more than by comfort or consensus. Progress in American history has rarely arrived quietly or without cost. It has come through confrontation, through people willing to endure loss, isolation, and danger in order to bend the country closer to its stated ideals. The story of America is not primarily the story of those who held power, but of those who challenged it when power betrayed principle. From the beginning, resistance was woven into the fabric of national life. The colonies themselves were acts of defiance against rigid social orders, yet that spirit of challenge did not end with independence. Once authority was established at home, it too became subject to questioning. The willingness to resist unjust power became not a threat to the nation, but one of its defining features, even when that resistance was labeled unpatriotic or dangerous. Struggle has taken many forms. Some fought with words, others with marches, others with silence that refused compliance. Enslaved people resisted through rebellion, escape, sabotage, and the preservation of identity under conditions designed to erase it. Their resistance was not always visible in textbooks, but it was constant, shaping the limits of oppression and preserving the possibility of freedom long before laws recognized it. Abolitionists faced ridicule, violence, and imprisonment for insisting that slavery was not merely unfortunate, but immoral. They were told they were destabilizing the nation, that they were too radical, too impatient. Yet moral courage often appears unreasonable to those who benefit from delay. Their persistence reframed the national debate, transforming what had been accepted into something that could no longer be ignored. The Civil War itself was a culmination of decades of struggle, but it did not resolve the deeper conflict over equality. The end of slavery created new spaces for resistance. As formerly enslaved people asserted rights they had long been denied, they built schools, churches, and political organizations, often under threat of violence. Their courage reshaped the meaning of citizenship, even as backlash sought to reverse it. Resistance did not always succeed immediately. The collapse of Reconstruction demonstrated how fragile progress could be when moral courage was absent at the highest levels of power. Jim Crow laws hardened inequality into daily life, enforced by terror and silence. Yet even in this era, tants did not vanish. It went underground, into communities, into stories, into faith, waiting for a moment to rise again. Labor movements at the turn of the 20th century revealed another dimension of struggle. Industrialization brought wealth and exploitation side by side. Workers organized against dangerous conditions, child labor, and starvation wages. They were beaten, jailed, and killed for demanding dignity. Their resistance forced the nation to confront the human cost of unchecked economic power, leading to reforms that redefined the relationship between labor and the state. Women's resistance challenged assumptions about gender and authority, denied the vote and legal independence. Women organized, protested, and endured imprisonment to claim political voice. Their struggle was dismissed as disruptive, yet their moral courage expanded democracy itself. When women finally secured suffrage, it was not a gift granted by benevolence, but a right claimed through persistence. The civil rights movement stands as one of the clearest examples of how resistance reshaped the nation. Ordinary people faced extraordinary danger to challenge segregation and racial violence. Children walked into hostile schools. Activists faced dogs, fire hoses, and bullets. Their power came not from weapons, but from moral clarity and collective action. They exposed the contradiction between American ideals and American reality in ways the nation could no longer deny. Resistance often provoked backlash, and progress was met with new forms of exclusion. Legal victories did not erase social hostility. Economic inequality and systemic discrimination adapted to survive. Yet each act of courage altered the terrain. Each challenge expanded the boundaries of what could be imagined and demanded. Resistance has also taken quieter forms. Journalists who exposed corruption, whistleblowers who risked careers, artists who challenged dominant narratives, teachers who insisted on truth, citizens who voted despite intimidation. Moral courage is not always dramatic, but it is cumulative. It builds slowly, shaping institutions and expectations over time. War has tested the nation's moral courage repeatedly. Soldiers have fought not only external enemies, but internal doubts about the justice of their missions. Protest movements during wartime have forced uncomfortable conversations about power, patriotism, and conscience. The willingness to dissent during moments of national fear has been one of the most contested expressions of American freedom. Struggle has never been evenly distributed. Those with the least power have often borne the greatest cost. Yet they have also been the source of the most transformative resistance. Immigrants demanding recognition, LGBTQ+ communities asserting humanity, indigenous nations defending sovereignty, students challenging entrenched norms. Each movement adding pressure to the nation's moral framework. The pattern is consistent. Progress full. Lows struggle, not comfort. Rights follow resistance, not consensus. Moral courage rarely begins in institutions. It begins in individuals who refuse to accept injustice as inevitable. These individuals are often dismissed, punished, or forgotten in their own time, yet their actions redefine the future. American history is a record of these confrontations between conscience and convenience. The nation has been shaped not by avoiding conflict, but by enduring it. Struggle has exposed weaknesses, resistance has forced reform, and moral courage has kept the ideals alive even when practice fell short. To understand the country is to recognize that its greatest strengths have emerged from its hardest moments. The ability to confront injustice, to admit failure, and to push forward despite resistance has been the engine of change. The nation has grown not because it was comfortable, but because people were willing to make it uncomfortable in the name of something better. Democracy in America has never been a finished achievement, but a continuous process shaped by choice, effort, and vigilance. From its earliest days, self-government was understood not as a static condition to be secured once and preserved forever, but as an ongoing practice requiring participation, restraint, and faith in imperfect people. The founders did not assume democracy would run on its own. They feared its fragility as much as they celebrated its promise. The earliest experiments in self-rule revealed how easily democracy could fail. Local assemblies were messy, contentious, and slow. Decisions reflected bias, fear, and self-interest as often as wisdom. Yet the willingness to argue openly, to vote, to compromise, and to accept outcomes became habits that mattered. Democracy survived not because it was efficient, but because people were invested in the act of governing themselves. The Constitution itself was designed with process in mind. It did not assume virtue, it anticipated conflict. Checks and balances separated powers, and regular elections were not expressions of trust but of caution. The system assumed that ambition would counter ambition, that debate would prevent domination, and that no single group should hold permanent authority. Democracy was built as a mechanism for managing disagreement rather than eliminating it. Voting rights reveal the unfinished nature of the process. At the nation's founding, participation was limited to a narrow segment of society. Over time, pressure expanded the electorate, but always unevenly. Each expansion required struggle, and each victory faced resistance. Democracy advanced in waves, not lines, reflecting the reality that rights can be gained and then constrained, recognized and then undermined. Moments of crisis have tested the process repeatedly. War, economic collapse, and social upheaval have tempted Americans to trade liberty for security. At times, they have done so willingly. Sedition laws, internment camps, surveillance, and suppression have emerged during periods of fear. Each episode raised the question of whether democracy could survive its own anxieties. Elections themselves have been contested, flawed, and sometimes unjust. Corruption, intimidation, and exclusion have marked many chapters of the story, yet the commitment to return to the ballot, to argue over legitimacy rather than abandon the system, has sustained the process. Even when outcomes were disputed, the expectation of continuity preserved the structure. Democracy depends not only on institutions, but on culture. A free press, independent courts, and civic education are not automatic protections. They are choices renewed by each generation. When these supports weaken, democracy does not collapse immediately, but it erodes gradually. The danger lies less in sudden overthrow than in quiet neglect. The role of citizens has always been central. Democracy does not function as a spectator sport. Participation extends beyond voting to organizing, protesting, debating, and holding leaders accountable. Periods of apathy have coincided with the concentration of power. Periods of engagement have forced reform. The process responds to pressure because it was designed to DR. Democracy's resilience has been tested by inequality. When large segments of society feel excluded from opportunity, participation loses meaning. Economic power can distort political voice, turning process into performance. These tensions reveal that democracy requires more than formal rights. It requires conditions that allow those rights to be exercised meaningfully. Technology has reshaped the process without resolving its vulnerabilities. Communication has become faster, broader, and more fragmented. Information competes with misinformation. Outrage competes with deliberation. Democracy now operates in an environment of constant stimulus, testing the capacity for reasoned debate. The process adapts, but not without strain. The expansion of democracy has also involved redefining who belongs within it. Each inclusion has required reconsidering assumptions about citizenship, equality, and representation. These debates have been uncomfortable because they challenge settled hierarchies. Democracy advances by unsettling comfort, forcing societies to re-examine who has a voice and why. Judicial interpretation has played a role in shaping the process, translating constitutional principles into lived reality. Courts have expanded and restricted rights at different moments, reflecting broader social pressures. The law has never been neutral. It has been a site of struggle where the meaning of democracy is negotiated. Democracy's continuity depends on norms as much as laws. Respect for outcomes, restraint in victory, accountability in defeat, and faith in institutions sustain the process during disagreement. When norms weaken, legal structures alone cannot compensate. Democracy requires a shared commitment to the idea that losing today does not mean exclusion tomorrow. The process has survived because it allows correction. Amendments, reforms, and reinterpretations acknowledge imperfection without abandoning the system. The ability to change rules without violence has been one of democracy's most powerful features. Each correction reflects the understanding that self-government is a practice, not a possession. Democracy endures through repetition. Each election, each debate, each peaceful transfer of power reaffirms the process. Failure does not negate democracy. Refusal to engage does. The system assumes that people will disagree, err, and struggle, yet continue to show up. To see democracy as a continuous process is to reject the idea of final victory or permanent decline. It is to recognize that self-government must be renewed through action, attention, and responsibility. The work is never complete because society never stands still. Democracy moves as people move, reflecting their choices, their fears, and their hopes in every generation. Each generation is responsible for carrying the promise forward, not as a ceremonial inheritance, but as an active obligation shaped by the conditions of its time. The ideals that define America do not renew themselves automatically. They survive only when people choose to engage with them, challenge them, and adapt them to new realities. History does not move forward on memory alone. It moves on responsibility. From the earliest days of the Republic, the future was understood as uncertain. The founders spoke often of posterity, aware that their work would be judged and reshaped by those who followed. They did not expect permanence, they expected revision. The Constitution itself was designed to invite change, reflecting an understanding that no single generation could foresee every challenge or resolve every injustice. Generational responsibility has often emerged in moments of crisis. When inherited systems failed to meet lived realities, people were forced to act. The fight against slavery was carried forward by those who refused to accept compromise as destiny. They did not create the ideals they invoked, they inherited them and insisted they be taken seriously. In doing so, they transformed abstract principles into moral demands. BR, responsibility has rarely been evenly distributed. Young people, immigrants, the marginalized, and the excluded have often carried the heaviest burden of change. They were asked to believe in promises that history had not yet kept. Their willingness to demand fulfillment reshaped the nation's trajectory. Progress has often come from those who had the least to gain from patience. Every generation faces the temptation of complacency. The gains secured through struggle can feel permanent, making vigilance seem unnecessary. Yet history shows how quickly rights can erode when they are assumed rather than defended. The absence of pressure allows old inequalities to adapt and reassert themselves. Responsibility requires memory not as nostalgia, but as warning. Education plays a central role in transmitting responsibility. What a society teaches about its past shapes how future citizens understand their role within it. Sanitized history encourages detachment. Honest history invites engagement. When people are taught that progress was inevitable, they are less likely to recognize their own obligation to sustain it. Generational responsibility also involves moral imagination. Each era confronts challenges that previous generations could not have predicted. Industrialization, global war, civil rights, digital surveillance, climate change, and inequality have demanded new interpretations of old principles. The promise remains constant, but its application must evolve. The tension between tradition and change defines generational duty. Respect for inherited institutions must coexist with the willingness to reform them. Blind reverence freezes progress. Reckless rejection erases hard-won lessons. Responsibility lies in discerning what must be preserved and what must be transformed. Moments of progress are often followed by backlash, testing whether the next generation will defend what was gained. Reconstruction faltered when responsibility was abandoned. Civil rights advances faced resistance when vigilance waned. Each retreat revealed that history does not guarantee forward motion. Responsibility must be continuous, not episodic. Generational responsibility is expressed not only in grand movements, but in everyday choices. Voting, organizing, speaking out, and refusing to normalize injustice are acts that accumulate over time. Silence, too, accumulates, shaping outcomes as surely as action. History records both. Leadership reflects generational values. Those elected and elevated mirror the priorities of the moment. When responsibility is embraced, leadership expands possibility. When it is neglected, leadership exploits fear and division. The connection between citizens and institutions remains reciprocal. Economic systems test generational responsibility by revealing whose prosperity is protected and whose is deferred. Decisions about labor, opportunity, and distribution reflect moral choices as much as practical ones. Each generation decides whether growth will be inclusive or extractive, whether success will be shared or concentrated. Technology intensifies responsibility by accelerating consequences. Information spreads faster than reflection, power concentrates quickly, and mistakes scale rapidly. Each generation must decide how tools are governed, who benefits, and who is protected. The promise of freedom must contend with new forms of control. Generational responsibility also requires humility. No era fully resolves the challenges it inherits. The goal is not perfection but progress, not purity but persistence. Understanding this tempers judgment of the past while sharpening accountability in the present. The promise carried forward is not static. It is reinterpreted through struggle, expanded through inclusion, and tested through conflict. Each generation leaves behind not a finished nation, but a direction. The measure of responsibility lies in whether that direction bends toward justice or away from it. History does not ask future generations to repeat the past, but to respond to it. The inheritance is not a set of answers, but a set of questions. Who belongs? Who decides? Who benefits? Who bears the cost? Each generation answers anew, consciously or not. To carry the promise forward is to accept that democracy, equality, and freedom require work without finality. The responsibility is heavy because the stakes are human. Lives are shaped by decisions made long before they are born and by choices made in moments that feel ordinary. The future judges not intentions but outcomes. Generations are remembered not for what they believed, but for what they protected, expanded, or allowed to erode. Responsibility is exercised in the space between memory and action, where ideals become lived reality. Thanks for watching this video, and don't forget to like and subscribe.